Alrighty, so we are sitting down for another one-shot review. The movie that I watched today was Failsafe, and this is an old movie. To my knowledge, this is from like the 60s or something like that, but this exact print of the movie is from the 80s. And just to kind of give you an idea of what this movie's about, I'll just kind of read the back. I feel like that gives a better synopsis than me trying to give it to you. But it says, nuclear weapons, computers, increasing international tensions, a frightening combination with the potential for ultimate destruction, the end of mankind. What if a computer malfunction was somehow to trigger a sequence of events which could possibly result in a nuclear war? Okay, so there's more on the back here, but that's basically what happens here. So the premise of this movie is that, and by the way, it's in black and white, and it stars Henry Fonda as the president, as well as Frank Overton as, like, I'm pretty sure he's the guy that plays this one, like, political scientist. But this movie explores a couple different perspectives in an ongoing situation where the fail-safe system, which is supposed to be used to give out the order to drop nuclear bombs on an enemy country, is malfunctioning and telling these fighter pilots without a shadow of a doubt that the president and that the United States has the intention to drop bombs on Moscow. And this is not true, right? Like, the malfunction is a malfunction. Nobody wants this to happen. It's a complete mistake. And no matter what they try to do, they can't get in contact with these planes to tell them to turn around. And even when they do, they've been ordered via their orders that they are given to pass a certain point, not take any verbal orders, because it may be some sort of interference or something from the enemy or God knows what, right? And so even at that point, they're unable to get these guys to turn around. So that kind of sets up the situation where, how do we solve this problem and what eventually unfolds? So this movie begins, and what I mean by it takes a couple different perspectives. It begins first with this general at home waking up in a deep sweat after having a dream about a matador who's killing a bull, and he's like in the audience kind of freaking out. Which, first of all, first comment, I always forget that literally matadors are not just, having fun time with the bull and making them and tricking them and making them look silly. Like, they're literally sticking swords in this dude. It just, in retrospect, it's rough to look at, but I know it's not my culture. I don't really understand it, but it's just like, dang, man. And obviously I eat beef, so, let's get that on the table. But just watching that was a little bit like, ooh, I forgot that was the case. Kind of not cool. But that's unimportant to the movie a little bit. But basically, we start off with him, and he tells his wife that he's got to go on, this big trip to a big meeting in Washington, and they're all going to talk about strategy, and he can't wait to, give some important analysis that he has. And his wife is like, oh, could you stay? Come on, you don't need to go, da-da-da. He's like, no, this is important. I need to go. But it's also kind of funny to think that, like I said, this movie, I believe, is from the 60s. The idea that even people as formal and important as these high-ranking generals had the kind of lifestyle where they could treat work as something like, oh, well, I'll just tell them that, I couldn't make it today because of this or that. Obviously in the movie, he's like, miss a day in the middle of the week, that's immoral. But it just is funny to me to think about, in contrast to the way we think about jobs today, where let's say you show up at like 8:05 instead of 8. It's like you've just committed heresy and you're in danger of being fired, right? But, I mean, it's not really like that, but you get what I'm saying. That being said, he goes off to this meeting. Now, flip, we also meet another important character in this movie in another setting where we have a political scientist giving a talk, I believe at the White House, but it's at least somewhere like this, and he's kind of holding court. He's a little bit of a a douche type, if I'm being honest. But I think back then, that was like a way that somebody could be. So I think we think guys like this are a douche outright, but maybe this was like a type of person that existed back then. But regardless, he's kind of holding court, doing his thing, trying to like, oh, well, that's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that. Like doing a whole bit, I guess. And he's like, oh, I guess I've been holding court for too long. I guess I better get out of here. And it goes to show how the average civilian who's not actually involved in all of these conflicts or the decisions that are happening with these conflicts are so easy, so willing to put the lives of other people at stake for these logical decisions. So even in this conversation, we have this guy who's a non-service member political scientist talking about loss of life related to war. And then you have another civilian being like, well, who cares? I mean, why don't we just, this, that, the other thing, it's all a cost of war. What difference does it make? And like, I'd rather have an American way of life than the Soviet or what have you. But they're so willing to talk about this with Gibb, even though we're literally talking about the lives of millions of people. So when I first watched this scene in the beginning of the movie, I didn't think it had much significance. I can definitely see how it plays into the way the rest of the movie plays out, and especially into the arrogance of the political scientist character as the movie goes on. But this guy, political scientist, ends up at the same meeting as our general, right? And in between this, we get another perspective, right? We get to see the fail-safe room, the control room where they're monitoring this giant monitor and they're able to see what's going on, and they're the ones that send out the fail-safe system, signal to tell them to bomb people. But in general, what they're really monitoring is whether or not Soviets are making an aggression towards our American planes, and not, like he even says, like, we get one of these alerts 6 times a month and all of them end up being nothing. Right, as far as alerts that they need to respond to, not fail-safe signals. But the reason why the one general is talking about this to another guy is that the guy who is in charge of basically auditing how the money that's been appropriated has been spent is there. And so that's a nice plot device as to how they're kind of explaining how all the systems work. And this is where another important theme of the movie comes up, where, we're walking into this scene with him being like, we have all the best shit money can buy. And by the way, we have stuff that you can't even dream exists. And by the way, this, that, the other thing could happen, but we have battened down those hatches, and this is just about damn near foolproof. And one of these instances where we get signals happens 6 times a month, but it's always not a big deal. And even if it was, our guys would be able to handle it. And really, this is highlighting like the confidence and maybe even the arrogance that we put into technology, especially new technology. Right now, I'm reading a book. I think I might do a review on this book just because it's interesting, but it's called Super Money by a guy under the pseudonym of Adam Smith. And he has an interesting paragraph in this book, at least the portion that I've got to, where he talks about the rise of consultants in financial institutions, and how even back during the 70s, they would tell people like, oh, what you really need is this state-of-the-art computer system that will put you leagues ahead of the competition. Meanwhile, misunderstanding that, for one thing, there's no trained workers that know how to use this system. Nobody understands how it works other than the people selling it. And when something goes wrong, they won't even know that it is going wrong. Right? They don't even know what they're looking at when they're looking at this stuff. So they had a bunch of stories of financial institutions that spent all their money on the next latest and greatest system, and it eventually caused them more problems than good in comparison to the companies that just did modest technological improvements and continued to focus on the way that they're working. So what's my point in bringing all that up is that this is a similar logical fallacy that, or maybe it's not even a logical fallacy, maybe I'm using that incorrectly, but this is a similar fallacy that humans fall into all the time, especially as our technology gets greater, is that we just have this inclination to trust that the latest and greatest thing is working. And this trust is like a form of faith in and of itself. It's almost, the technology religion, right? You're like, nothing can go wrong because I have the newest iPhone, right? I can do all these things. If I didn't have it, I'd be screwed. That's why I need it, right? While in the case this is really not true, and even in some cases, outside of even just something like what this movie is exploring with the implications of war, this technology is not something that you can put blind faith into. And this movie explores that by this crazy mechanical malfunction happening, causing basically a group of fighter jets carrying 20 megaton bombs to Moscow to go and try to attack Moscow. Now, once this happens, the movie really kicks in gear, right? Obviously. And what is interesting is it evolves into this discussion where you have, on one side of the fence, you have the general who woke up in sweat from the dream, basically advocating in favor of doing whatever they can to stop this attack, to reel this attack in, even if that means at the loss of life of the servicemen that are currently carrying the bombs to Moscow. Because in order to reduce harm overall on the world, in order to stop the doomsday scenario where bombs are going off everywhere, nuclear war happens all over the globe, and we are all dead, he thinks that it's worthwhile to take down these servicemen and retreat and try to smooth things over with the Soviets because of the implications of nuclear bombs being dropped. And this is literally Cold War stuff, right? Like on purpose. But then on the other side of the fence is our snarky political scientist guy who keeps trying to make all these points about like, well, listen, it was bound to happen anytime, so now that this has happened, this has given us the perfect opportunity to stamp out communism and do the first strike and blame it on the accident. Like, the accident is true, but we can use this as an opportunity to do the first strike and put an end to, communism once and for all. And the guy, I hope that this is his acting and he was meant to be written to sound like an arrogant POS, but literally, it just makes your blood boil the way he's like, so what? We could put it, he even at one point talks about Pearl Harbor as Japan was in the right because logically we were their enemy and they saw, capitalism or just our way of life as this existential threat, and to get rid of us would secure the safety of them futures to come. And first of all, yes, if you put yourself in the mindset of them, then maybe you can understand why they would make an attack like they did. But that is to not learn the lessons that we've all learned, which is that the cost of human life is too great, and that these sort of things are actually not the best way to handle problems, nor are they the only way to handle problems, right? And now I'm not going to get into a discussion about war in general because that's really not my place. And I'm sure that you guys would find that I am in favor of it in certain scenarios, but it's just the idea that this guy is oh, well then this means we should bomb them. Who cares about the outcome? It's so ridiculous. It's crazy. And he won't shut up about it. He literally, there are multiple times where, even the president, and this is something where there's almost a third side of the story, the president in this situation ultimately has the call, right? And he is saying, no, we can't bomb these people. We have to stop it in any way possible. And he even gets in contact with the fighter pilot and tells him, this is the president. You need to turn around. And the guy's like, sorry, I'm not supposed to change what I'm doing at this point in the orders. He is a good soldier. He's just following his orders. But unfortunately, those orders being the way they are, they set up a situation where Moscow is going to get bombed. And then what's even more interesting is the dynamic where the generals, the servicemen, are talking about the Soviets, right? You would expect that the people that are actively trying to work against them every day and monitor their activity every day and are willing to go to war against them for the country would be the ones that have the least respect for them, just out of the nature of their job and how they have to see them as the enemy. But in fact, it is the snarky political scientist who has the least respect for the Soviets as a people in this movie. And in multiple instances, the generals have a much more clear head because they see their adversaries as an intelligent, rational person who also wants to minimize the loss of life. And I think that in general, that is how most people would act. Like, the Soviets are not going to see this mistake. They're not going to put together some machination that causes the nuclear bombing of Moscow just to allow for the nuclear bombing of the US. Like, that is not what anybody wants. Even China right now, as tensions are raising in our own current day, is out here saying like, hey, I think we all need to figure out how to de-escalate this a little bit, right? So it's just like, to have respect for people as human beings, like all of us to some extent, no matter how evil, they might be, understand the nature of dropping a nuclear bomb. Unfortunately, the US has the pleasure of showing everybody what that would have done so long ago, but it's just that, like, this movie does such a great job of showing how distorted people's minds can become when they start to see people as an enemy, and when they just start to do all these different logic trees to figure out how they could be in the chess move position that's in front of the other guy. When in reality, like, none of these things in between are even happening. And in the way this plays out, the Soviet premier and the United States president both want this to stop and for there to be no bombs. And they're willing to work together even at the conflict of all these other generals in different positions who don't necessarily understand what's going on, saying that this is like the most psychotic thing that they could be doing and that they should be striking back with full force and preparing and all that kind of stuff. Because, like, that's what they've been trained to do. That's what they've been told their response should be. So I guess I just kind of went on like a long rant, but my point is that this movie turns into a very interesting case study in not only how we think about war and how we think about our enemies in war and how we should maybe have respect for people as common human beings and things like that, but also that our technology is something that we put so much faith in, almost to a foolhardy degree, where we are literally opening ourselves up to situations like this just by putting these layers of technology in between us and giving them that faith. Like, for example, one of the reasons why they can't get in contact with the bombers early on to change what they're doing is because the Soviets are jamming their signal. So when the bombers call in to go, yo, is this real? They can't get through, right? Now, another thing we find out later is that the Soviets' jamming apparatus literally was, designed in such a way where it had caused that double mechanical fault to happen that caused for the signal to be sent for the bombs to be dropped. And we also find out that in multiple instances in the movie, like, the Soviets have greater technology in this area than we thought. The Americans have greater technology in this area than the Soviets thought. And they have to work together to iron these things out in order to actually solve this problem. And that makes all sorts of people in different ranks in these rooms freak out, to the point where one of the US generals literally has a meltdown, hits a dude in the head with a phone, and tries to take control of the situation by force, and then obviously gets dragged out. But it's like, this whole situation made people go crazy, all the way up until the point where, if I dare spoil this movie, I'm about to spoil it, by the way, so if you want to watch it, like, skip ahead 30 seconds. But the resolve that the president of the United States comes to in order to avoid full-scale war across the entire world is that because the bombs will accidentally be dropped on Moscow, he asks for a plane to start hovering above New York with the same level of bombs, so that when Moscow is bombed with these nuclear bombs, so is New York. And therefore, it is almost like, in principle, equal bloodshed, and therefore there is no retaliation to be had. and it proves that it was a true mistake. And as crazy as that might sound, it really is one of those things where it would be the cost of many to save the lives of many, but just kind of an unfathomable situation to think about, you know? And that is kind of where the movie ends, where the bombs do actually end up being dropped, and we're left with our same general from the beginning of the movie who woke up after the dream kind of being in charge of dropping the bombs, and he like has a panic attack and faints before it happens. I think I kind of skipped through the credits because the audio was really annoying, but I think they end up dropping the bombs on New York, which, by the way, like the fact that they decided to go with an ending where this bad stuff actually happened and it completed as bad is very, very interesting to me. And it goes to show you that at the end of the movie, once they realize the bombs are going to be dropped on New York, the first thing the political scientist says is he's like, while there may be nothing important to run the government in New York, document-wise, a lot of our most important corporations keep their documents there. And so it will be at the utmost importance that we try to save those documents before this happens in order to save our economy. So it's like literally faced with the most terrible and disgusting thing that ever happened in human history, the most tragic circumstance, the technology failing us to the point where 2 massive cities full of millions of people are vaporized. The first thing this guy is like, all right, well, how do we cover for the corporations? Like, Jesus Christ, my dude. Anyway, so I guess I've probably been talking for a while. I feel like I've given a good idea of what this movie's about and kind of like, you know, the positives as to why this is worth watching and stuff like that. First, as I transition into like the review piece of this, I just want to say that I did watch this on Laserdisc today because I found it for $6 at the exchange. Personally, my Laserdisc for this guy, even though I'm about to touch it with my fingers, it's gonna be even worse. You probably can't tell on the camera, but it's not in the best condition, and that definitely was apparent at the beginning of the movie, but it got better as it went on. So if I were gonna recommend you guys watch this movie, I would try to find it not on Laserdisc. If you can find it on DVD, that's great. I do think there's a Criterion collection of this, like on 4K Blu-ray, that I'm going to purchase because I did like this movie. But I wouldn't watch it on Laserdisc, not that you guys are going to be doing that anyway. But that being said, when I think about this movie, what are the things I really like? I really like that it was able to explore those different controversial angles of this sort of thing happening. And I really love that it honed in on the faith in technology, because that's something that I become more hip to the more I start to not only get into old tech, but kind of see how things have evolved over time and how people treat technology. Like there's a System of a Down song called Science where he's basically saying like, you know, believing in science is the same as believing in faith, and science has also failed us, right? But I think this is one of those situations where, you know, that point is proven a little bit, where we had all this faith in this technology and yet, you know, things can still go wrong. So another thing too is that like there's even this part in the movie where the political scientist is like, yes, but what you have failed to consider is that there is a human operating each of these machines. And like he literally says it like that, I swear to God. And the guy, the electronics expert, comes back on the phone and he's like, well, that's not necessarily the case. Like these things move so fast and the things that go wrong with them are not so, you know, readily apparent to the naked eye that you really could not respond to this fast enough to fix it, as is what's happening, right? So I thought that was really interesting. I thought that, you know, for the most part, the movie was really good. I think it definitely had some staples of like older movies where it moves a little bit slower due to the editing style. And I actually kind of enjoyed it by the time I was finished with the movie. think it was slow to start, and I'm not sure if I quite understand what the Matador significance is, like, specifically to the themes of the movie, but I really did enjoy the movie. And I would say, you know, this movie out of 5 probably clocks in at I would say it's probably a light 4. Mostly because even though where it may not be as exciting or as gripping as other movies from an entertainment perspective, I think that, you know, at the beginning of the movie, I was like, am I going to have trouble getting into this black and white movie? And by the end, I was literally sitting there like, oh no, he's not really saying that. Oh my gosh. Like, you know what I mean? I got into it so much. I really enjoyed this movie, and I think the themes that it explores are really interesting and still relevant today, maybe even more so than they would have been maybe 10 years ago. So there's that. So I would give this movie a light 4. So that's the review on the movie Failsafe, starring Henry Fonda as the president. And I think you guys should give it a watch. I think it's probably worth picking up or streaming to watch it at some point in your life. But yeah, that's a review.